Hello and welcome to Faith Informed, an Engage International podcast where we seek to clarify truth claims, challenge prevailing ideologies, and commend the faith. Today I'm joined by Dr. Paul Gould, an associate professor of philosophy of religion and director of MA in philosophy of religion at Palm Beach Atlantic University. He's also the founder and president of the Two Tasks Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Hey, Sam, it's great to be with you today. Thanks for having me on.
Paul, you wrote this new book, A Good and True Story. I got a hold of it and I read it. It's really well written. Would you tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book?
Yeah, it's okay, good. So a couple years ago, I wrote a book called Cultural Apologetics, and that was a book written to Christians thinking deeply about how do we have a conversation with our culture about the gospel, and how can we show that Christianity is true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be. And as part of that book, one of the sort of more hopeful, prescriptive parts of that book, I argued that we can basically join with God and each other to re-enchant reality. And part of what I meant there is that we return to reality by doing two things. Number one, that we learn to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And number two, we learn to invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And those two ideas are two future book projects, one for Christians. I have a lot more I want to say about this idea of re-enchantment and spiritual formation and things like that. But the second idea of inviting others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does is for non-believers. And that's actually the book that I just wrote. So it's one of the two books that kind of flow from the Cultural Apologetic book. And again, it's not a book about cultural apologetics. It's actually a book of what I would say of cultural apologetics written to non-believers, just helping them, just pointing to all the things in this world that I think are suggestive of the divine and that point in this beautiful way to Christianity as the true story of the world. So that's partly why I wrote it.
In your book, you point to 11 clues or signposts that points us to something beyond concrete material reality. You're looking at some features of physical reality and sort of working backwards to the most likely explanation. What narrative or story best explains these facts or features? And this approach is a type of inference, right, called abduction or inference to the best explanation that is frequently used both in everyday life and in scientific reasoning. So you're using abductive reasoning to say something like, if God doesn't exist, so much of what we know about the universe, about life, and the human experience becomes more mysterious and inexplicable. So I would like to talk to you about some of the features of our universe that you take to be signposts or pointers to God. But before I go there, I'd really like to hear your story of how you became a Christian, and then we can go into those signposts or cairns, as you put it in your book.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for asking. So let's see. Freshman year in college, going way back to 18 years old. I thought of myself prior to that as religious. I had sort of grown up around the church, not necessarily in the church. I went to church, but I just missed the gospel. And actually, two guys came knocking on my door one day with a Christian organization and just asked if I was interested in talking about spiritual things, and I wasn't. But I was also very non-confrontational, so I invited them in, and we had a conversation. And I can remember they basically shared the gospel with me at that time. And I can remember thinking to myself after they left, wait a minute, if this is true, like that's not my understanding of what Christianity is or means. And so I realized that I realized the possibility of its truth, and I realized that if it was true, that I'd missed the boat. And so that conversation with those two students set me on a journey, actually, of discovery. And so I now know this is not normal, but my freshman year, I went to an apologetics class at a church with my Christian friend, the only guy that I knew in the dorm that was a Christian. He had identified himself as a Christian. And he said, hey, I'm not going to judge you when you get drunk, but, this is who I am. And so Mike took me to this apologetics class every week for the entire freshman year. And I can remember week after week, the professor would come in with a stack of books and talk about some piece of the overall case for Christianity. And at the end of the class, they would ask me a question like, well, what do you think of the evidence? And I would say something like, it's pretty compelling. And then they would say something like, well, at some point you need to make a decision. And I would say, yeah, I know. And that kind of went on for about a year. But finally, about that summer, after my freshman year, I was actually reading a Bible at the time. I think I just was very clearly moving toward Christianity. I was reading in the book of Revelation, and I think I just realized at some point that summer that, okay, wait, I do believe this stuff is true. And I also realized, and this is a kind of divine grace, that I would be a fool to put it off. I think part of my sort of foolish idea was, hey, let's have some fun in college and then we'll put God back in. And I just sort of realized that summer, no, that would be foolish. If this is true, I need to be all in. And so at some point that summer, I bent my knee and became a Christian. And it was kind of, the idea was I'm either 100% in or I'm going to walk away from this religion and not be religious at all, like not worry about God at all. But I was just convinced by the evidence that it's true. And that kind of set me on a journey that leads to the kinds of things I'm passionate about today.
And getting into those cairns, let me start with the origin of the universe. With the advances in modern science, we have found explanation for a whole lot of puzzling questions. Many natural phenomena once thought to be inexplicable or caused by a supernatural entity or divine being can now be explained purely by the natural sciences. The gaps in knowledge that we posited God as an explanation for are being filled. As a result, the God of the gaps, or like the God hypothesis, is less and less useful. And there is this belief that is gaining popularity in some circles that in time we will have exhaustive knowledge and will not need God at all. In fact, some believe that time is already here, and we have physicists like Lawrence Krauss and the late Stephen Hawking who argue that the universe did, in fact, come from nothing. Why do you think that the religious story or the theistic story offers the best explanation for the origin of the universe?
Yeah, I love the way that you phrased the question. Why does it offer the best explanation for the existence of the universe? And I think, how to summarize that? I think perhaps there's two metrics. That is the quick, easy way to kind of maybe get at why I think the godly hypothesis is not out of a job, right? And it has to do with two words: explanatory power, and this word called elegance, which is closely related to explanatory fit. And so we have these phenomena before. So you're right. The gaps have been closed, right? There's things that we used to invoke deity to explain, and we now know that, lightning isn't caused by Zeus being mad and throwing thunderbolts or something like that. You're right. The gaps have closed in some areas, but what's actually the case, though, the more we know and learn about the universe, the gaps expand in other areas. And so I think the origin of the universe is one of those areas. The more that we know, the more the gap widens for the possibility of a naturalistic explanation. And that's why you actually alluded to it. The best naturalistic explanation is that there is no explanation, right, for the universe. It just is. It just exists. It's brute fact. That's not an explanation. That is an account that has a certain kind of explanatory power to it, but it doesn't have a nice explanatory fit. It's not elegant, and it doesn't, I think, explain as well. And so, in a nutshell, and I can go deeper if you'd like, but I think it's explanatory power and elegance or explanatory fit. The theistic hypothesis accounts for the certain features of the universe, and I'm thinking of four in particular that are best explained or fit best within theism. And real quick, the four that I catalog in the book are the fact that the universe is contingent, that it exists, but it didn't have to exist. Number two, the fact that it's temporally finite, for our best science tells us that the universe began a finite time ago. Number three, that it's immense. And number four, that it's finely tuned. And all of those features of the universe cry out for explanation, and I think the best explanation is that God exists.
But sometimes, like, you have people, and I think even Richard Dawkins and most of the atheists, new atheists, so to speak, bring up this idea that, well, the universe, why should the universe have a cause? You just mentioned that right now. It's a brute fact. And then they ask the question, well, if God does not need a cause, why should the universe need a cause? Who created God? That is a question that's brought up often as well. What would you respond to someone whose response to the cosmological argument is, all right, then tell me who caused God, who created God?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of an embarrassing question he probably shouldn't be asking it. It's a little outside of his area. And so, because it's a philosophical question. So yeah, it all depends on what the universe actually is. If the universe is in fact contingent, right, then I think that it's reasonable to ask what caused the universe to come into being, right? Especially if it's finite, temporally finite and contingent. Everything that we know that's contingent requires a cause to bring it into being, right? And so that question seems appropriate in the case of the universe. Now, to go on and then say, well, then if God is the cause of the universe, who caused God? Sometimes people say, well, that's just a category mistake. That kind of a question is a category mistake. And what they mean by that is, well, traditionally, when you think of the concept of God, at least on theism, right, a very intuitive concept is that God is something like a personal being that's worthy of worship. And packed into that concept of worthy of worship, there's a whole lot of sort of conceptual machinery that's working there. And one thing that sort of falls out of that is that a personal being that's worthy of worship would be the kind of being that has the firmest grip on existence itself, right? In other words, that it cannot not exist. Mm-hmm. We call that being a necessary being. And so God, to be worthy of worship, wouldn't be a contingent thing, because contingent things are dependent things, and dependent things aren't ultimate things, right? So God can't be created, because then God would be a finite, dependent thing. And so to ask, well, then what caused God is like saying, how do you square the circle, right? It's almost a logical contradiction. Because God, what flows out of the definition often, I think, and often people think this, and I would think this, what flows out of that definition is the kind of being that has a very firm grip on reality such that it cannot not exist. In other words, that God is a necessary being. And it doesn't make sense to say of a necessary being, a being that cannot not exist, who created God, right? Typically, necessary beings are the kinds of things that exist in virtue of themselves. They exist in virtue of their own nature. And so that's the quick reply. I've read Dawkins, The God Delusion, and as a philosopher, his chapter on the God hypothesis, it was pretty out of date and recycling some 19th century atheistic arguments that there's better representative examples of philosophers that are atheists that are writing sort of high-level arguments, but I wouldn't go to Dawkins and those kinds of questions when thinking about this.
Yeah. And when you think of the cosmological arguments, they draw from our intuition that things don't come into existence from nothing. And when I hear physicists like Stephen Hawkins, the late Stephen Hawkins, or Lawrence Krauss talk about the universe from nothing, it is quite intriguing because they always point to something like the law of gravity or quantum mechanics. So it's not really nothing, is it? Why do you think they use this language, a universe from nothing, when they always point to something? Are they really confused about nothing, or what is going on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how to psychoanalyze Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing. Yeah, I've read that book, and you're right. The nothing is actually something. It's the quantum vacuum, and the nothing is the fact that the energy level cancels itself out, so it's like zero or close to zero. So it's like nothing in that way. But that's not what nothing is, right? Nothing. And so again, this is where philosophy can really help. And I think our concepts do have some semantic range, right? We have a range of meaning with our concepts, but they don't have a range that's sort of unbending, and you can just stretch them, as far as you want. And I would say that I don't know exactly why. Maybe they're wanting to claim that word nothing to bring it into concert with things that I don't know, religious people say, like, God created the universe out of nothing. I don't really know what the reason is, but they could just benefit from some conceptual analysis, and philosophers are the ones that are most apt to do that. And typically when you say nothing exists, you mean there is no thing that exists in reality. Not that there is some quantum vacuum fluctuation that has an electrical charge of zero, right? That's something. So yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't have an answer except that it's a poor use of that word.
Yeah. And one of the features of our universe that you refer to in your book, and you just alluded to it a few minutes back, is the immensity of the universe. It is awe-inspiring, the sheer vastness of our universe. How does the immensity of the universe point to a creator?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think it directly does. It's the immensity plus the fine tuning that points to the creator. But why I was so fascinated and I wanted to include the immensity, because what I think it does do, though, is it awakens us to wonder. Right? The more that you contemplate the universe and the vastness of it, I'm reading this book right now on cosmology, and I was reading a chapter last night on, where we get all our elements, the 92 naturally occurring elements that are basically in the furnace of stars and then dying stars, spreading them to the universe. But it's just this amazing story of the evolution of our universe from nothing to what we see today, at least in our neck of the woods, but it's immense beyond our neck of the woods. So I think what the immensity does for me, at least, is it awakens wonder, and it sets me on a journey to seek an explanation for the cause behind it all. And whatever that cause is, the more you look at the nature of the universe, it's, number one, incredibly powerful because there's a lot of energy packed into the universe. And number two, given the fine-tuning piece that you begin to kind of discover as you're considering the immensity and the nature of the universe, incredibly intelligent too, right? Because everything's fine-tuned on this razor's edge for life. And again, evoking wonder, but also a raising curiosity to what best explains it, what has the best explanatory power and the best explanatory fit. And that's where I think that theism does the best job in doing that.
I think you're spot on, Paul. The sheer size of our universe, its vastness, it's indeed awe-inspiring. And you just brought up fine-tuning. It is widely accepted that our universe is fine-tuned for life. It is a well-established scientific fact. Even a small variation from the actual values of the fundamental constants and the initial conditions of the universe would have made life impossible. But how do we get from the fine-tuning of the universe to a fine-tuner? What reasons do we have to think that the universe, which is fine-tuned for life, is fine-tuned by a fine-tuner? There is a God to fine-tune it. What if our universe is just one universe within the multiverse? Because if there are infinite universes, then it is no longer surprising that one of them is fine-tuned for life.
Right. Yeah. And this is, again, fascinating. There's the simple argument from fine-tuning to God is something like on theism, it's not surprising that the universe is fine-tuned for life. On naturalism, it is surprising that the universe is fine-tuned for life. Therefore, given this likelihood principle, which is a principle of logic, the evidence from fine-tuning strongly supports theism, right? So there's the kind of simple bare bones argument, but the pushback would be, at least from the naturalist side, to try to up to refute like that second premise that it is surprising on naturalism that the universe is fine-tuned, is to up the probabilities by increasing the number of universities from one to up to infinity, right? Not all models, multiverse hypotheses, go to infinity. Some are finite models, and some are infinite models. what's interesting is I'm pretty open to the multiverse. I don't have any reason to think that there is one, although I do read the literature, both philosophical and scientific. What you might be interested in is a number of Christian philosophers argue on philosophical and theological grounds that God, given these principles of plenitude, and God's goodness, would create an actual multiverse. If God was to create anything, he would create more than one universe, right? So you have arguments in the literature there. So the point is, even if you add the multiverse, I don't think it gets rid of the godly hypothesis. It just pushes the buck back a stage, right? Because instead of asking the question, what caused the universe, you can still ask the question, what caused the multiverse, or what caused the multiverse generator, if it's a finite number of universes that are currently being spawned off by the universe generator. So that's maybe one quick thing. The other thing I would say is that depending on the model, the multiverse hypothesis that you're working with, because there are a number of different ones, some of them lack empirical adequacy, right? They don't actually have any evidence. Others, you have sort of indirect evidence from maybe inflation, which is a phenomena, cosmological inflation, early inflation. Maybe there's some indirect evidence, but those are going to be finite models that require a fine-tuner of the mechanism that's spawning the thing. So either way, and the dialectic is a kind of interesting and complicated one, either way, it doesn't refute that second premise that on naturalism it's still surprising, because you still need intelligence to spawn off these universes. Or on the other hand, you don't have any empirical fit. If it's the infinite variety, there's no evidence for that. That's a philosophical postulate for other reasons. The dialectic continues, but I think the best, simplest explanation, especially given what we now know, is that either way, God is the best explanation.
I think the multiverse doesn't explain fine-tuning. It just relocates it at another level, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So another signpost or cairn you talk about that points to God is the origin of life. Now, the origin of life poses a very difficult problem for the physicalists. How did life arise from non-life? On physicalism, life is the byproduct or is a product of blind natural processes. Scientists have postulated numerous theories, such as panspermia, the theory that life originated in outer space and was transported to Earth by an asteroid or maybe a spaceship. Others have speculated that life arose from a prebiotic soup. So some scientists today remain optimistic of finding an answer to this challenge, and they think it is only a matter of time before they can solve it. Why do you think the non-religious story fails to explain or cannot explain the origin of life? And why do you think that the religious story offers the best explanation for the origin of life?
Yeah, it's good. It's going to come down to those two metrics, explanatory power and elegance, or fit with the data. I just don't think on naturalism, pure naturalism, you have enough resources to go from chemistry to biology, right? In the book, I look at, you're right. It's interesting as a philosopher trying to read the scientific literature. You have these wildly different postures toward the evidence. You have naturalist, atheists with incredible confidence that it's just a problem to be solved, but someday we will solve it. And then you have other scientists that say, no, you're all lying. It's not that easy of a problem at all. It's not even close to being solved. In fact, we'll never solve it, right? And so it's kind of interesting as a non-scientist trying to wade through that. But I think you can make your way to at least reasonable judgments, right, of what's more plausible. And I think that what I looked at specifically was the cell, which is this fascinating, all life is cellular life, and the first life would have been a cell or some protocell. And you have these two problems that I call the ingredients problem and the assembly problem, right? The ingredients problem is we have no known naturalistic mechanism for accumulating and producing the sort of macromolecules that are necessary for life. So you have this ingredients problem. We've tried origin of life experiments since at least the 1950s have tried to reproduce the early Earth. Of course, you're right. Earth is the only place we know of life, but sometimes we have to postulate to maybe it's out there in the stars somewhere. But even if you got all the macromolecules, right, there's the assembly problem. It's incredibly complex how to take all those macromolecules and put them together in the right way, and to get the kind of information that's embedded, especially when you get eukaryotic life, right, life that has DNA in their cell and genetic codes and things like this. You have this mark of intelligence, you have this incredible complexity, and you have this, the steps that are needed. And so just looking at the evidence as best I could, I just think that is one of the causal joints in the story of the unfolding history of reality that is very hard to explain on naturalism. And then again, on theism, you have incredible explanatory power. Either God front loads the kind of powers and propensities and guides the process, or he just divine intervenes at some point in history, say 3.7 billion years ago here on Earth, to create the first life, right? You have the kind of resources that you don't have. And of course you have fit too, right? Because life, we have this intuition that life is something incredibly valuable. And that if we were to destroy all of the known life in the universe, we would judge that is a loss in value, right? So we have this deep intuition about the value of life. And of course, on theism, you would expect God to create valuable things like living organisms, because God is wholly good and all beautiful, and he's going to create things that have that kind of value. So again, that's what it kind of comes down to. It's fascinating. I want to continue learning in this area, but that's kind of where I landed in the book.
You just alluded to the value of life, the sacredness of life. I was just about to ask a question on that, because we have this intuition that we matter, human life is valuable. And can this intuition be explained on a materialistic worldview if we are just organized mud, a mere byproduct of time plus matter plus chance, made up of the same substances that make up the stars? Then how do we ground our intuition that human life is valuable? If the same blind evolutionary processes that coughed up the ticks, the mites, the reptiles also brought us forth, then what is it that gives us intrinsic value? What is it that makes us special?
Good. Well, yeah, I mean, so you're right. That's a great question. I love Eric Weilenberg, who's a non-theistic philosopher that works on these things, and he just thinks it's obvious that we're intrinsically valuable as persons and that there's other values and things. And so he's going to try to give an account that somehow is consistent with naturalism. He's kind of an interesting naturalist where he's like a non-natural naturalist, where he posits these brute facts, these brute values, and maybe that's just the end of it, right? You just stipulate that, no, we just are, because you can see it, right? And I think we can see it by the light of reason that we're incredibly valuable. So that's one route, is just to say it's just a brute fact, we just are, and there's no further explanation. Another route is to try to ground it in some structural feature that humans possess, to show that we're unique in kind and not just unique in degree over like the apes, for example. And so we could point to the rationality or the moral capacities or the imaginative capacities that we have as humans. The problem is, at least on the Darwinian and the neo-Darwinian story, I mean, Darwin said that we're just different in degrees from the ape, right? That we just have bigger brains. And so there's at least streams of what I would call Russellian naturalism from Bertrand Russell that say, no, we're not any different. Yeah, we're higher primates, but that's just a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. And so we can't actually ground our value. So in some ways, you have like this competing dialectic between two versions of naturalism. You have what I would call Russellian naturalism. And so Bertrand Russell, who was a famous 20th century atheist who famously said in his book, Why I Am Not a Christian, he said that if man is just the co-location of atoms, all we can do is build our lives on the firm foundation of unyielding despair. Right? So there's a very clear-eyed atheism that says, no, you're not valuable. Or we can have kind of a more, Platonic version of atheism that tries to maintain these kinds of intrinsic values in a godless world. And you can do that, but again, it comes down to explanatory fit and explanatory power. And I'm going to argue, it's going to sound redundant now, but I'm going to argue, again, theism does a much better job on those two metrics. So,
yeah, I was thinking when you were mentioning about Bertrand Russell and building on the unyielding firm foundation of unyielding despair. What was that again? That quote, I'm just blanking out on it at this moment. Yeah. Anyways, we constantly hear of human rights in our day: right to life, liberty, free speech, freedom of expression, freedom from slavery. But we cannot talk of universal and inalienable rights without recognizing that human life is intrinsic worth. Rights presuppose value, right? But how can we ground intrinsic worth on a naturalistic framework? On an atheistic framework, we're just the mere product of time plus matter plus chance. So if we are cosmic accidents, how do we ground our value? And if we can't ground our value, then how do we meaningfully talk about rights? And on the Christian worldview, the Christian worldview provides a solid ground to talk about human rights. Humans are created in the image of God. Therefore, we have intrinsic worth. We are infinitely valuable, so we can meaningfully talk about human rights. The Christian vision of what it means to be human is so rich and so profound. So I was just thinking about it as you were talking about the bankruptcy of the atheistic worldview, especially, and how difficult and challenging it would be to talk about human rights and worth and so on. Now, one of the other cairns or signposts that you talk about in your book is meaning. If we are just the product of blind natural causes, if we are molecular machines, I think that's the word that Carl Sagan used. If we are cosmic orphans in the vast sea of nothingness, destined to extinction, then what is the ultimate meaning of our lives? Because whatever we do now, the difference we think we make, will ultimately amount to nothing. We are just a blip that appears and then fades away into nothingness. So how does the religious story, in contrast to the non-religious story, speak into the really hard problem of meaning?
Yeah, I love how you phrase that, the really hard problem of meaning in a materialistic world. That's the title of a book by Owen Flanagan, who I interacted with in the chapter on meaning, because I thought that was a great way. Philosophers talk about the hard problem of consciousness. How do you reconcile the reality of consciousness in a materialistic world? Well, Flanagan says the really hard problem is reconciling meaning in a materialistic world. And so in the book, so it's interesting, we've transitioned from features of the world, like, the universe exists, or life, or species, or humans, where you're going from phenomena to cause. So you're going from effect to cause. At this part of the book, actually transitioned to looking at the interior of the human heart and then saying, well, what best fits the deep longings of the human heart? And of course, one of the deep longings of the human heart is to live a life of significance, to matter, right? To find meaning and purpose and value in life. And so what of all the competing stories fits best? So that the direction is going now the other way, from these desires of the heart to the stories out there in the world. So I actually considered 4 stories, 3 naturalistic ones and then 1 supernatural story. Absurdism, which is the view that there is no meaning to life at all. Nice nihilism, which is a nicer version of that nihilism that says, well, there's no meaning, but let's have fun. And then I considered Flanagan, his really hard problem of meaning, and it's a kind of what I called enchanted naturalism. And to me, for my money, if I were not a believer, I would seek meaning in enchanted naturalism. And the idea that he kind of argues there is that no, you can have a kind of subjective meaning in life, even if there's no ultimate meaning of life, right? So there's a distinction, that meaning in life versus the ultimate cosmic meaning of life. There is no cosmic meaning of life because, as you said, everything ends in heat death or cold death or whatever. We all end, and there will be nothing on the naturalistic story. So there is no meaning of it all, but there could be still meaning in life. And where do we find that? Well, for Flanagan, we find it basically in this amalgam of culture and science and religion and art and things like that. And that's good enough, he actually says. And that's the kind of meaning that has to be good enough, right? But the problem with that view, there's a number of problems, is one, I don't think it goes deep enough to the deep longings of the human heart for transcendence, for a story that's true to the way the world is and true to the way the world ought to be. Number two, there's what's called the problem of the end. And the example I use, it's from a different philosopher named Joshua Sechrist. He talks about, hey, if say that you're dating someone and you know that you're not going to marry this person, well, it kind of affects how you feel about dating that person, right? You just know that it's going to end at some point. Why don't you just end it now, right? And that's the problem of the end. So applied to these global stories on naturalism, we know that the story will just end in nothingness, right? A vast sea of nothingness, like you said, that's Nietzsche. And that the fact that we know the ending of this story is one of extinction and annihilation on the naturalistic story actually infects the meaning, the subjective meaning that we can have today, right? So enchanted naturalism is the best option, on my view, given naturalism. But there's this other story, enchanted supernaturalism, and I look at Lewis here, who talks about how the deep longings of the human heart are like lock and key on the supernatural story with the way the world is, and that there's this deep meaning because God exists and God endows it with meaning and things like that. So, of course, there's people trying to ground meaning in a godless world. And I would point people to Flanagan. I think he does the best job that he can. But even there's problems in terms of fit. And Christianity does the best job. And so it's suggestive, again, of evidence for Christianity as the true story of the world.
Given the brevity of life, and if, there is no life after death, I wonder if it makes more sense to be a hedonist. I don't know. I'm just curious. Is that pretty similar to nice nihilism? Or is there a difference between nice nihilism and hedonism?
No, that's basically nice nihilism. It says, hey, guess what? There's no meaning in life, so let's party. Let's have fun while we can. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And again, that would be great, right? For my money, that would be the second fallback option I would take. But thinkers have pointed this out, when you divorce meaning from pleasure, the pleasure becomes vapid over time, right? And it loses its pleasure. And so, unfortunately, you can't unhinge or detach pleasure and the pursuit of pleasure from the pursuit of meaning. And so on nice nihilism, that pleasure is going to become unsatisfying quite quickly, right? And therefore, what we think is like comedy becomes tragedy. And it becomes tragedy all the way down on the story that is nice nihilism, right? And that's not a good story. That's not a good result.
Wasn't it G.K. Chesterton who said meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain, but meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. I'll have to track down that quote. But that's the idea. Yeah, exactly.
The next cairn that I want to touch upon is morality. So if scientific materialism or physicalism is true, then there are no moral facts, right? Morality is just a social construct, but I think it'd be difficult for anyone to deny that there are objective moral values and duties because we can clearly see the wrongness of some actions like torturing an innocent man or stealing, rape, murder is just plain wrong. So there are some physicalists, atheists, who would say, well, there are objective moral values and duties. They are inexplicable. They just exist. They don't need an explanation. They are just brute facts. Why do you think that approach fails? Why do you think that it is not the best explanation for objective morality?
Yeah, it's interesting. Notice, because we've kind of been walking through all these different phenomena, and either through your question or even by what I say, the best atheistic answer often is it's just a brute fact, right? There is no explanation for why it is the case that we have objective values, right? These are the most attractive versions of atheism that I would land on if I were an atheist, right? And in every case, what I would want to say is that it doesn't go deep enough. And I would say the same thing with morality, right? It doesn't go deep enough. to say that it's a brute fact. I mean, you have all these questions, like in philosophy, when we do mature metaphysics and theory comparison, you want to have like as little, let's see, the less brute facts you have, the better the theory, because it's what's called it has ideational economy, right? The more brute facts, the less attractive the theory is. And so if you have moral facts that are objective, and you have, but they're all brute facts, well, you have a very unattractive theory, right? Because you have all these facts about the world that are left unexplained. And we've not just talked about morality, we've talked about a whole host of things that would be unexplained on the naturalistic story. So it's a very ideologically unparsimonious view, right? It'd be better if you could find explanations for things that seem to cry out for explanation, or at least an explanation for why they can't have an explanation. But the brute facts actually multiply, because then you have all these questions like, okay, fine, we have these brute facts. Torturing babies for fun is wrong, right? And honesty is a virtue. Why? They just are. But then you have this question, well, then why does the act of torturing the baby hook up with the property of being wrong, right? And the answer is it's just a brute fact. And so now you're multiplying your brute facts by, orders of infinity, probably, but for every act that there is. How does it hook up in the way that it does to either the rightness or the wrongness of the act, and so on. And so they become very unlovely theories in the end. I think when it comes to morality, though, apart from all the theoretical, like sort of unparsimony when it comes to multiplying of brute facts, we have this intuition that we owe obligations when we talk about moral duties. We have obligations to people, right? I'm obligated to you to tell the truth, to not steal your wallet, things like that. But I'm not obligated to this chair that I'm sitting on to not weigh 500 pounds, let's say, right? Because I don't have obligations to things. I have obligations to people, right? That's an intuition. And if that intuition is correct, and I submit to you that it is, well, then theism can naturally accommodate that. Again, there's that nice fit. But on Platonic atheism, or brute fact atheism about morality, you don't why am I obligated to an abstract object or to a fact, right? That's not the right kind of thing, right? We're obligated to people. So at least for those reasons, and I catalog actually 4 reasons in the book why it's not the best explanation. Those are just a couple for why I'd want to, for why I think it's not the best explanation.
One of the deepest longings of the human heart is for happiness, or is happiness. Yeah. We all seek to be happy. As the ending for almost all great tales go, they lived happily ever after. Happiness is the goal, the ending we are after. Wasn't it Blaise Pascal who said, and I think you quote Pascal in the book, all men seek happiness. The seeking is without exception. They may employ different means, but they all tend to this end, even those going to war and others avoiding it. The motive that lies behind every action of every man is happiness. How does the non-religious story speak into our pursuit of happiness? If survival is the ultimate goal of evolution, then we should be happy just surviving, right? But we're not happy just surviving. Can we make sense of this deep yearning, this longing for happiness on a purely materialistic, physicalistic worldview?
Good. So it all depends on what happiness is. That word classically, happiness in the Greek mind would be this word eudaimonia, which is a kind of flourishing in light of our nature. For the Hebrews, it would be the word shalom, which is a kind of peace that's more than the absence of strife, but a kind of wholeness of life, kind of right relating to reality. But that word happiness is, talk about conceptual engineering, right? We talked about why do the scientists use the word nothing when they're really talking about something, right? Happiness has gone through a number of sort of changes in terms of what people think it is. Over the years. And I think today, popularly on the street, what happiness usually is like what people think they are after when they say, I just want to be happy, is some kind of sensual pleasure or, unfettered satisfaction of desires. But But that's just not what happiness is, right? So part of this depends on what happiness is. And if the best naturalistic accounts of happiness, actually this is more complex. Popularly, happiness usually is some kind of subjective feeling of pleasure, right? There are naturalistic philosophers, thinking of like the Aristotelians, who do ground it on the more ancient way, right? And so they have it in a conception of human flourishing. But I'll just set that aside for now. The contemporary popular view is no, we're happy if we can satisfy these desires. That's not going to work, right? Because that's just not what happiness is. We need to understand the kind of being we are, and the purpose, the telos, the way that our natures find fulfillment, right? And so there's a whole metaphysic behind this question. So the question, I just want to be happy, is actually primarily and first a question about cosmology. What is the nature of the world, or metaphysics? What is the nature of the human person? Once we answer that question, we can answer what is happiness and how do you get it? So I think what the naturalistic story shows to me is that these shallow subjective views of happiness just are obviously misfiring, right? Because, while many of us do have a kind of subjective happiness, that sort of wanes up and down over the course of our lives, and we're told that many in our culture are incredibly depressed, and not subjectively happy in that way. That's why we're, on Paxil and antidepressants and things like that. Yeah, so I think I lost the thread of your question, but the most important thing is we need to understand what happiness actually is. And on the Christian story, we get this telos. God created us, and what the objective good, the thing that we're created for, is union with God. That's what actual happiness is. And it's more than that, right? It's union with God, it's harmony with each other, it's rightly related to self and rightly related to our end, right? So we have this rich conception. And I would just submit to you that thick conception of happiness fits the contours of the human heart, right? And it fits the grain of reality in a way that any sort of superficial view on offer, given naturalism, just doesn't satisfy.
I think you're spot on, Paul, because when you were talking about happiness and being rightly, happiness is a relational property in your book of being in a right relationship with God, and that is integral to happiness. It's union with the perfect union with perfect happiness, right? So in our human experience, happiness is elusive. It feels like a chasing after the wind. You were talking about pleasure. People think that happiness consists in maximizing pleasure, only to find themselves disappointed. We think we'd be happy if we had that job, that life, that house, or more money, or more something. And we find ourselves still empty and unhappy. I think it was Thomas Sass, the psychiatrist, who said, happiness is an imaginary condition formerly attributed by the living to the dead, now usually attributed by adults to children and by children to adults. So if it is true that God created us for himself, to know him and to enjoy him, then we cannot find contentment, lasting joy, and complete satisfaction and fulfillment in anything in this world, right? Perfect happiness, like you say, or like you write about in your book, comes from being united with God. But is there a difference between happiness and joy?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I know that people do make that, so I'm not going to have something profound to say here. I do know people make that distinction, and sometimes I hear it like joy is what we experience in the Lord apart from our circumstances, and happiness is maybe the subjective stuff. I don't know, though, actually. I think that, at least when I think of objective happiness and joy on the Christian story, they kind of eventually come together, because that thing that we are created for is union with God, and there will be great joy. And there is great joy as we commune with God even today, right? I mean, that's the great beauty of the gospel. I think of John 17:3, that Jesus says, that you can have eternal life in me, and you can have it now in relationship with him. And so we have that joy. We have that happiness, even in this life, although it's imperfect, and we're progressing toward that perfect joy, that perfect happiness. So I don't know. You probably have a better answer than me on that one. I'd like to think more about that. I know Lewis, when he uses the word joy, Sehnsucht, it's pretty close to how I'm thinking of this objective highest value of happiness. But that's all I don't know. Sorry. Great question. I don't have a great answer.
I think you're spot on. But part of what I'm trying to understand also is sometimes we have, I don't know if this is an intuition that we have, like for us to be happy, like pleasure is an ingredient of happiness. Wealth is an ingredient of happiness. But are those necessary ingredients? Like, are those necessary conditions, so to speak? Can we have happiness without pleasure? Can we have happiness without wealth? Does that make sense? Does my question make sense?
It does. And I think I would want to say yes, we can have. So those things do figure in as ingredients, but we can have happiness or joy. Maybe that was part of your question, right? Apart from these things. And so that's probably, again, what's so interesting, and this is where Eleanor Stump, who's a philosopher, has been super helpful in my own journey thinking on these things. She's the one who, in her book Wandering in Darkness, talks about these deep longings of the heart that God has given us, right? So God desires our flourishing, and God desires to meet the deep desires of our heart. So we have flourishing, which is like our objective good, and then we have the deep desires of the heart, which is like our subjective goods. And in Christianity, they sync up, because in Christianity, the highest objective good, which is union with God, syncs up with the deepest subjective longing of the heart, which is to know God, right? Augustine famously said in the Confessions, our hearts are restless, O God, until they find rest in you. So, that's the beauty of the Christian story, is you get both, right? You get the objective value and you get the subjective deep longing of the hearts that perfectly coincide. And so, you can have that happiness because it's union with God. You can have that joy without the other stuff. And the other stuff can come and go, and you can still be happy, right? At least that's how I would hope in my life. I have it pretty easy, I think. But I would hope if I didn't have some of the pleasures in life, I could still find that kind of deep happiness or joy because of my relationship with God.
Can we think of happiness along these lines of, like, we have this deep longing within our heart, and that longing, often we're not able to identify the object of our desire, and the deepest desire of our heart is for God, and when we find the object of that deep desire, then we find happiness.
Yeah, that's right. I love it. I mean, this is so, Eleanor Stump, she says, think about all your desires like an inverted triangle. So take the set of all the things you long for. Think of it as an inverted triangle. At the top, you've got your surface desires, and then as you go down, you have your deeper desires, and then at that bottom, you have the deepest desire of the human heart. That's the subjective longing for God, right? Right above that deepest longing of the heart, at the bottom of the triangle, you have like deep desires. And there, I think it's things like love, justice, beauty, meaning, all that stuff's right above it. And it's just pointing toward the deepest longing where we ultimately find our fulfillment in that. And so, I think that I like the way that you put it, because I think it does make sense to me. All these things, what we're doing, and this is why Lewis, when he gives his argument from desire in a number of places, sometimes he runs it with that deepest desire, the transcendent desire for God. But like in The Weight of Glory, he runs it through the desire for beauty, something one step up in that triangle, right? And it's through, he says, you don't long for the beauty, but you long for the beauty through the beautiful thing, right? And that beauty turns out to be God. And so, all these things, I think, if we pay attention, they point to God as the ultimate source of our longing.
And wasn't it the psalmist who says, in his presence there is fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore? Right? So there is nothing worth desiring apart from him. And I think it is in Psalm 27 that David talks about, one thing have I desired of the Lord, to be in the temple of the Lord, to behold his beauty, the beauty of the Lord. So that deep longing for the king, if there was one request that you could make of the Lord. That one sole request was to be in his presence, to be surrounded by his beauty. So moving on to the next signpost, love, a word that is quite common in our lingo these days, right? Mm-hmm. It is something we hear of often, a word that we're very familiar with but are confused about. Our obsession with love is reflected in the movies we make. But I think there is a confusion surrounding the nature of love. What is love?
Yeah, this was one of my favorite chapters to write in this book that we're talking about, A Good and True Story. Gave me a chance to look at the literature on love. And I came across this quote by Joseph Pieper. I think that's how you say his name. He's a Catholic theologian, philosopher. Writes on the virtues, writes on love. But he said, the fundamental affirmation of love is, I'm glad that you exist. And I just, when I read that, it just resonated with me, right? Think about the claim that God is love, that God loves the world so much that he sent his only son. This fundamental affirmation, I'm glad that you are, right? I'm glad that you exist. Yeah, we're confused about love for sure in our culture, but if we think about it, and we do notice, and I talk about this in the book, A Good and True Story, like at least 5 features of love. And if you take these 5 features, they can help you kind of triangulate down to what would this account of love be. And those 5 features are that it's multi-directed, right? That we love objects, we love ourselves, we love people. It's complex, it's deep and enduring. It's active and passive, and of course, it's something of great value. And so I kind of cataloged the contemporary debate. There's actually a debate about the nature of love. Surprise, surprise. And what I found was that of the contemporary debates, actually, this 13th century monk, Aquinas, got it right, I think, at least on my view. I think he's closest to the truth. And for Aquinas, I'll give you his view on love, and your listeners can see what they think about it. But he says that love is basically 2 things. It's this longing for the well-being of the beloved, or the flourishing of the beloved, and it's the desire for union with the beloved. And of course, that takes on a different texture depending on the beloved and the different offices of love. But that seems right to me, right? I love that we desire the well-being of the people we love, and we desire to be united to them in ways appropriate to them. And that's a very rich conception of love, and it's one that I think is actual, right? Like, I've tasted that kind of love. I hope that I love my family and others in that way. And I think others have too. And so then that raises this question, what does this deep kind of love reveal about the nature of reality? So this was actually a super fun chapter to think about something that we all are not only confused about, but we all want, right? To be loved and to love. So.
I think love on the religious story is very rich, very deep. God loves because he is love, right? Yeah. Love is central. It is fundamental. It is at the base of reality. Love is the reason why the universe exists, why we exist. And God's love that we read of in Scripture, it is a self-giving, deep and enduring love, the very words that you just mentioned. But on the non-religious story, it is very shallow. It is just chemistry. It is identical to the firing of neurons. It has utilitarian value. It functions to attract and retain a mate for the purpose of reproduction. But I think it is very reductionistic. Think of the love that parents have for their children, or the love between friends, the love between siblings. So love seems to be much more than just an emotion and attraction. Although emotion and attraction is involved, it is deep and enduring. Mm-hmm. And you just talked about Aquinas and how Aquinas saw love as 2 interconnected desires, the desire for the well-being of the other and the desire for the other. And in the Christian story, we have this demonstration of love objectively on the cross of Christ, and we can have the subjective experience of God's love for us as we read in Romans 5, the Spirit of God pours out the love of God into our hearts, right? So I've just been moved by that, and I really enjoyed reading your chapter on love as well. as we move on, I want to look at the next chapter in your book, Beauty. Often in popular culture today, we hear that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It is not an objective value embedded in the world out there. It is subjective. It is in the mind. Beauty is not in the object, but it is in my perception of the object. So are there aesthetic facts? Is beauty an objective feature of the world? If there is objective beauty, then on a naturalistic framework, how does one explain the objective beauty in the world and the capacity we have as humans to recognize and appreciate beauty?
Yeah, this was also one of my favorite chapters to write and to just do research on as I wrote the book, A Good and True Story. It was, what's interesting is there's been a fairly good theological tradition thinking about beauty, and there's definitely some philosophical tradition thinking about beauty, but there's not been a ton of work on the argument from beauty to God. There were some early 19th century writers, and then there's been some people that have basically taken the moral argument and plugged it into aesthetic facts, but it's not very different. And so I really had a chance to kind of look at that and found some quite interesting things. So yes, I do think, to your first part of your question, that beauty is an objective feature of the world, right? In the same way that there are physical facts, I've argued that there are moral facts, and we can see them by the pure light of reason, right? That we ought to not torture babies for fun, or that honesty is a virtue. Well, in the same way, I think we see that there are aesthetic facts, right? I'm looking out my window here in Jupiter, Florida, and there's beauty all around here in South Florida. Looking at the sunset, right? It would be kind of weird to say. In fact, I quote Peter Forrest in the book. I have the book in front of me, but I don't have the quote. But he basically says it would just be crazy if someone looked at that sunset, beautiful sunset in the Rocky Mountains, or the other day we were walking here in Florida, and just gorgeous painting in the sky, and say, well, that's not really, that's just, oh, how terrible is that sunset to me? That would just sound really odd. I think that there's a philosophical case that can be made that beauty is objective. But when you go a little bit beyond that, then, and you attend to different features of beauty, it turns into a quite interesting argument for God. So here's two pieces of evidence that I think cry out for explanation with respect to beauty that I talk about in the book. Number one, that there's the beauty saturates the world. Everywhere we look, from the microscopic to the macroscopic, from the earthly to the heavenly, you see beauty and beautiful things. It saturates the universe. That's a fact that cries out for explanation. I'll explain why in a minute. Number two, though, there's this quality to beauty that I just call this transcendent quality. And actually, I think Peter Forrest might have called it that, one of these people looking at the argument from beauty. And the idea is that beauty, many thinkers, atheists and theists, have noted that beauty is evocative of the eternal in some way. It just points us beyond itself, and it's evocative of the divine. So you have these two facts, the fact that beauty saturates the world and beauty has this transcendent quality, and then you just plug it into an argument, and it goes something like this. On theism, it's not surprising that these two facts about beauty obtain, but on naturalism, it is surprising, therefore, by the likelihood principle. These facts about beauty provide strong evidence for theism. Why are they strong evidence for theism? Well, because think about the analogy with human art. As someone who tries occasionally to do art, it's really hard to create beautiful art, right? It's hard to create things that are beautiful. It's easy to create things that are ugly or that don't have aesthetic properties of beauty. On naturalism, as you noted, if it's just blind forces, you would not expect the universe to be saturated with beauty, right? But on theism, if the creator of the universe himself is an artist, you would expect it to be saturated, which is exactly what we find, right? So it's surprising on naturalism, but not surprising on theism that we have this. And of course, that it's evocative of the divine, of course, it makes the best sense given theism as well. Yeah, so I think there's actually a quite good argument from the objective fact of beauty to God. And that's what I had a wonderful chance to explore in that chapter, in that book. It's a lot of fun.
I think speaking on the objective fact of beauty, there are a lot of things that we can agree on and say that is beautiful, right? Even that calls into question the idea that beauty is subjective, right? Before we wrap up today, Paul, the last question I have for you is the religious story, particularly the Christian story, is seen as restrictive, an impediment to progress, irrational, discriminatory, hateful, prejudiced, and intolerant. However, as we read the account of the angelic annunciation to the shepherds, it is interesting to see that the birth of Christ was announced as good news of great joy to all people, for all people. Why do you think people are unable to see the Christian story for what it is, good news of great joy?
No, that's a great question. Great one to end on, too. It all goes back to the first question you asked. Why did I write this story? Why did I write this book, A Good and True Story? Two background assumptions that guided the writing of this book, right? I wanted to help invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. But here's two pieces of background that inform the way I wrote it. One is a thesis about reality. And that thesis is that reality is shaped like it's a story. It's a story. It's the true story of the world. It's the divine drama. Another thesis was a thesis about humans, and that is that we come into this world and we seek to take up our place in the true story of the world. So we're narratival animals, we're story animals. But then I have this thesis about evidence, and the thesis about evidence is that it's everywhere. It's widely available. But, as Stephen Evans, a Baylor philosopher, says, it can be easily resistible. And what he means by that is that it needs to be rightly interpreted, right? So what I wanted to do in this book was help them see the phenomena, the evidence, these clues for what they actually are, things that are signposts for the divine. Mm-hmm. And part of my earlier work is about the fact that we live in this disenchanted world where we don't see the world as it really is. And I lay this claim of disenchantment on all of us, Christian or non-Christian. So even Christians, we don't see the world in its proper light, and that's why we need to be re-enchanted. We need to see the world as it really is. So it is about properly interpreting and properly reading the world. And so part of it is just these large-scale worldview issues about the nature of reality. The other part of it I would lay firmly at the feet of the church. And this might sound harsh, but you ask the question, why do people not see the gospel as attractive and joyful? Well, it's because we are not the kinds of people that I think God wants us to be. We're not apprentices unto Christ. We're fragmented. We're anti-intellectual. We have unbaptized imaginations. These are all things I talk about in my first book, Cultural Apologetics. And those inform the way that others view our world and view Christianity. And so one of the things I talk about a lot, and I talked about this in the book Cultural Apologetics, is that Christianity suffers from an image problem, right? Christianity is no longer seen as relevant to people's lives, so we've lost the Christian voice. Nobody wants our ethic, right? Because number one, we're just as fragmented as everyone else. And number two, we read of Christians who disqualify themselves weekly. And number three, we watch ourselves on social media, and it's horrific. And so the church no longer can exercise a prophetic voice. So what happens is we've lost the Christian conscience. But then thirdly and lastly, Christians by and large use the same language as everyone else when we talk about the world we find ourselves in, right? We use language like it's everyday or it's ordinary. But that's not the world we live in, right? The world is created by God. And so the proper word, as C.S. Lewis discovered, is it's holy, it's sacred, right? It's gift, it's enchanted, it's created. And so we don't see the world in its proper light. And so, of course, others won't as well. So anyway, I could go off. I won't go off on that, but great question. I want to lay it at our feet and just encourage us as Christians to fall in love with Jesus and see the world as he does. And that would at least get us headed in the right direction.
Yeah, sometimes I use this analogy where I invite people to imagine standing in front of the Niagara Falls and being blown away by its beauty.
Right.
Then I have them imagine standing with someone who's wearing broken glasses that significantly impair their vision. They will each have vastly different experiences. You are able to see the falls clearly and take in all its beauty, whereas the other person is unable to see the spectacular beauty of the falls And the task of the Christian evangelist or the apologist is to take those broken glasses away and to give them a fresh pair of glasses so that they can see the beauty that is already there.
Yeah.
We don't need to make the Christian story beautiful or attractive, but the challenge in our call is to present the Christian story in all its beauty. And like you said, oftentimes we, rather than taking other people's broken glasses away, end up being broken glasses through which people see the gospel, and they don't have the experience they ought to have of seeing Christ in all his glory and all his beauty. And I keep thinking of John's gospel, where John wrote, "We beheld his glory, the glory of the one and only." Thanks so much, Paul, for joining me on the podcast today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to be with you, and appreciate your time.
For those of you who haven't yet gotten a hold of Paul Gould's book, A Good and True Story, I highly recommend it. You would love it. If you're listening on audio platforms like Google, Spotify, iTunes, please consider leaving a review. If you see this post on social media, you can help us spread the word by clicking like and sharing it with your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe and click on the bell icon so you're notified when a new video is released. We have some really good material coming up, and I don't want you to miss it. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time right here on Faith.